David Chen stood by the massive windows of his penthouse, staring at the city below like he owned it. In many ways he did. As one of the youngest investment bankers to make partner at his firm, he had everything money could buy. The $12 million apartment, the luxury cars, the designer furniture that looked more like art than something you'd actually sit on, but if you looked closer, you'd notice something missing. There were no family photos on the walls, no children's drawings stuck to the expensive stainless steel refrigerator, no toys scattered across the pristine marble floors. The place felt more like a museum than a home where 3 little girls lived. Those 3 girls were his daughters. Rachel was 8 years old, quiet and sensitive to everything around her. Certain sounds made her cover her ears and cry. Some clothes felt so uncomfortable on her skin that she'd tear them off. Bright lights gave her headaches. Grace was 6 and hadn't spoken a word since she was 2. She communicated by pointing, making gestures, and using a tablet with pictures on it. Then there was little Mia, just 5 years old, who needed everything to happen at exactly the same time every single day. If lunch was 5 minutes late or if someone moved her favorite cup, she'd have a complete breakdown. All 3 girls were autistic. David knew this, of course. He'd taken them to the best doctors, enrolled them in expensive therapy programs, and hired qualified nannies to take care of them. He did everything right on paper, but there was one thing he never did. He never really spent time with them. He never sat on the floor and played. He never held them when they cried. He never tried to understand what the world felt like through their eyes. 6 months ago, his wife Catherine had packed her bags and left. She'd stood in that very living room and told him he was more like a building manager than a father, that he treated their daughters like problems to be solved rather than children to be loved. David had barely reacted. He just asked her lawyer to send over the divorce papers and hired another nanny to fill the gap. That's where Rosa Martinez came in. She was 52 years old with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands showed years of hard work, and her clothes were neat but clearly not expensive. When she arrived that Monday morning for her first day, David was waiting in the kitchen with a typed list of rules. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask about her family or where she was from. He just handed her the paper and started talking. The house needed to be spotless at all times. Meals should be prepared according to the schedule he'd created. The girls needed to be kept quiet, especially during his work calls. She should clean the upstairs bathroom with specific products because he was allergic to certain chemicals. The list went on and on. Rosa tried to introduce herself properly, to tell him a bit about her background working with children. David cut her off mid-sentence. "I don't need your life story. I need someone who can follow instructions. Can you do that or not?" Rosa's smile faded, but she nodded. "Yes, sir. I can do that." "Good, I work from home most days. Stay out of my office. Don't let the girls disturb me unless it's an emergency. You'll find everything you need in the supply closet." With that, he turned and walked away, already on his phone making a business call. Rosa stood there holding the list, watching him disappear down the hallway. She'd worked in many homes before, but something about this place felt particularly cold. It wasn't just the modern, minimal design. It was the complete absence of warmth, of life, of love. The girls were in the playroom when Rosa first met them. Rachel sat in the corner with noise-canceling headphones on, rocking slightly back and forth. Grace was on the floor, organizing her toy cars in perfectly straight lines. Mia was at the small table, eating her snack at exactly 10:30. Just like her schedule demanded. They barely looked up when Rosa entered. They were used to new people coming and going. In the past year alone, David had gone through 7 nannies. Some quit because they couldn't handle the girls' meltdowns. Others left because they couldn't stand working for someone as cold as David. One had been fired for daring to suggest that maybe the girls needed their father more than another therapist. Rosa spent that first week observing. She watched how David communicated with his daughters, if you could even call it communication. He'd stand in doorways and bark instructions. "Time for therapy. Get in the car." Or, "Keep it down, I'm on an important call." He never got down to their level, never looked them in the eyes, never used a soft voice or a gentle touch. When Rachel had a meltdown over a scratchy sweater, David's solution was to hold her arms down and tell her to stop being dramatic. This only made Rachel scream louder, her whole body shaking with sensory overload. Rosa watched from the hallway, her jaw clenched, but said nothing. It wasn't her place to interfere. Not yet. When Grace tried to show David something on her communication tablet, he'd glance at it for half a second and say, "That's nice, honey," before walking away. He never actually looked at what Grace was trying to tell him, never tried to have a real conversation with her. Grace would stand there, tablet in hand, her little face falling as her father disappeared. With Mia, David was just rigid. He enforced her schedule like a drill sergeant, but he didn't understand why she needed it. When Mia got anxious because he changed which route they took to school, he just got frustrated. It's the same destination. Why does it matter? He couldn't see that for Mia, every detail mattered. The route wasn't just a way to get somewhere. It was a piece of the puzzle that made her world make sense. On Friday of Rosa's first week, something happened that showed Rosa exactly what kind of household this was. David was working in the living room, important papers spread across the coffee table. He had a big client presentation the next day, and the documents represented months of work. Little Mia wandered in carrying her juice cup. She was trying to be careful, walking slowly like she always did. But her foot caught on the edge of the rug. The cup flew out of her hands and landed right on top of the papers. Purple juice spread across the white documents, ruining them instantly. For a second, everything froze. Mia looked at the mess, then up at her father, her eyes going wide with fear. David exploded. His face turned red and he shouted loud enough that his voice echoed off the high ceilings. "Do you see what you've done? Do you have any idea how important these are? Why can't you just be more careful? Why can't any of you just be normal for one day?" The effect was immediate. Mia froze completely, her body rigid with terror. Upstairs, Rachel heard the shouting and started having a panic attack, covering her ears and rocking violently on her bed. Grace, who was in the kitchen, immediately ran and hid under the dining room table, her safe space when things got scary. David stood there among his ruined papers, looking at his 3 daughters falling apart because of him. For just a moment, Rosa saw something like regret flash across his face. But then he just grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the apartment without another word. Rosa stood in the doorway to the living room watching him go. Her hands were shaking, not with fear but with anger. She looked at little Mia, still frozen in place. At Grace curled up under the table. At Rachel upstairs, lost in her fear. These weren't problems to be managed. They were children who desperately needed love. And their father couldn't see it. Or maybe he could, but he didn't know how to give it. Rosa took a deep breath and got to work cleaning up the mess. But in the back of her mind, she was making a decision. She could either stay silent and collect her paycheck, watching these girls suffer, or she could do something about it, even if it meant losing her job. She'd been in that house for 5 days, and already she could see the truth. David Chen was a successful businessman, but as a father he was completely lost, and his daughters were paying the price. 2 more weeks passed in the Chen household and nothing changed. David continued treating Rosa like she was invisible, leaving cash on the counter instead of handing it to her, communicating through short text messages rather than actual conversations. He'd walk into a room where she was cleaning and not even acknowledge her presence. To him, she was just part of the furniture. Another thing he'd purchased to make his life run smoothly. Rosa did her job perfectly. The house was always spotless. Meals appeared on time. The girls' schedules were maintained. But every day she watched the same sad pattern repeat itself. David would leave for the office early, come home late, and spend maybe 20 minutes total with his daughters before retreating to his home office or his bedroom. The girls had gotten used to Rosa by now. Rachel would sometimes take off her headphones when Rosa was around, which was huge. Grace had started showing Rosa things on her tablet, little pictures and videos she wanted to share. Mia had even let Rosa adjust her schedule slightly to add in a story before nap time. These small acts of trust broke Rosa's heart because she knew these girls were capable of so much connection. They just weren't getting it from the person who mattered most. Thursday evening of week 3, everything fell apart. David had an investor call that was supposed to end at 6 but ran late. He was in his office with the door closed, his voice occasionally rising as he negotiated some complicated deal. Meanwhile, the girls were having the worst day Rosa had seen yet. Rachel had been to a birthday party at school, which meant loud music, screaming kids, and complete sensory chaos. She'd held it together all day, but the moment she got home, she was done. Her nervous system was completely overloaded. Grace was frustrated because David had forgotten to charge her communication tablet the night before, and now it was dead. She had so much she wanted to say but no way to say it, and Mia's favorite therapist had called in sick, which meant her routine was completely disrupted. The substitute therapist had used different techniques, sat in a different chair, even smelled different. For Mia, it felt like her whole world was crumbling. Rosa had planned to stay until 6, but she could see the storm building. Maybe she should have left right then. But something stopped her. Some instinct that told her these girls were about to need someone, and their father wasn't going to be there for them. At 7:47 exactly, it all hit at once. Rachel started screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure sensory agony. She was pulling at her clothes, at her hair, completely overwhelmed by sensations that felt like physical pain to her sensitive system. Grace, unable to communicate her frustration, started banging her head against the wall, the only way she knew to express the feeling trapped inside her. And Mia had a full-blown panic attack in the corner, hyperventilating so hard she could barely breathe, her little face turning red. David's office door flew open. He stood there staring at the chaos, and Rosa watched his face go through several emotions at once. Shock, frustration, and underneath it all, pure helplessness. He had no idea what to do. He tried his usual approach. "Rachel, stop screaming right now. Grace, stop that immediately. You're going to hurt yourself. Mia, breathe normally. Just breathe." His voice was firm, commanding, the same tone he used in business meetings. It was exactly the wrong approach. Rachel's screams got louder. Grace banged her head harder. Mia's breathing got more rapid. David actually tried to physically restrain Rachel, grabbing her arms to stop her from pulling her hair. This made everything worse. Rachel started thrashing, her screams turning to pure panic. Rosa stood by the front door, her hand on her bag, watching this disaster unfold. Every instinct told her to leave. This wasn't her problem. She was the maid, not the parent. If she interfered, she'd probably get fired. She should just walk out and let David figure it out himself. But then she looked at those 3 little girls and she couldn't do it. She couldn't just leave them suffering when she knew she could help. She set down her bag and walked past David without asking permission. She didn't wait for him to tell her what to do. She just moved. First, she went straight to the light switches and dimmed everything. Then she turned off the television that was blaring in the background. She closed the curtains to block out the bright evening sun streaming through those massive windows. The whole apartment got quieter, darker, calmer. She approached Rachel slowly, not trying to touch her or restrain her. She just sat down on the floor a few feet away and started humming. It was a simple tune, low and rhythmic, something her own grandmother had hummed to her as a child. She didn't look directly at Rachel, didn't ask her to do anything. She just created this bubble of calm and let Rachel find her way to it. Slowly, Rachel's screams turned to sobs, then to whimpers. Her body stopped thrashing. After 5 minutes, she was just crying softly, the sensory overload starting to fade now that the environment was less overwhelming. Next, Rosa went to the charging drawer and pulled out Grace's backup tablet. She'd noticed it there her first week and made sure it was always charged just in case. She sat down next to Grace and gently stopped her from hitting her head, not with force but by redirecting her hands to the tablet. Grace grabbed it immediately and started tapping frantically, all the things she'd been trying to say all day finally pouring out through pictures and words. Rosa sat with her, reading every message, responding to each one. "Yes, I see the dog. He's very cute." "You wanted to tell Daddy about the dog?" Grace nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. "We'll tell him together later, okay? When you're ready." Grace leaned against Rosa's shoulder, exhausted from trying so hard to be heard. Finally, Rosa turned to Mia, who was still hyperventilating in the corner. She knew that just telling someone to breathe normally doesn't work. Instead, she sat down facing Mia and started doing exaggerated deep breaths herself. In through the nose, count to 4. Out through the mouth, count to 4. She made it into a game, holding up fingers to count. Mia, desperate for anything that felt like structure and routine, started copying her. Slowly, her breathing regulated. Then Rosa did something that surprised even herself. She started Mia's complete bedtime routine from the beginning, even though it was now past 8 o'clock. She walked Mia through every single step. Bathroom, brush teeth, put on pajamas, read the same story they always read, sing the same song. It took 30 minutes, but by the end, Mia was calm. Rosa tucked all 3 girls into bed together in Rachel's room. which had the darkest curtains and the softest lighting. She read them a story in her slightly accented English, her voice soothing and steady. The girls curled around her like she was the sun they orbited around. Rachel leaned against her left side. Grace held her right hand. Mia had her head on Rosa's lap. They looked more peaceful than David had seen them in months. When Rosa finally emerged from the bedroom, David was still standing in the hallway. He hadn't moved. He'd watched the entire thing through the partially open door. Watched this woman he'd treated with such dismissiveness accomplish in 30 minutes what he couldn't do in 3 years. For the first time since Rosa had started working there, David really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. He saw the exhaustion on her face from dealing with the crisis. But he also saw the love, the patience, the understanding. Rosa met his eyes. She was done being silent, done staying in her place. These girls deserved better, and someone needed to tell him. Those little girls need more than a schedule and a paycheck, Mr. Chen. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. They need someone who sees them. Who really sees them, not as problems to fix or appointments to manage, but as people, as your daughters. She picked up her bag from where she'd dropped it by the door. They needed their father tonight. And where were you? 10 feet away behind a closed door, choosing a phone call over your children. David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? She was right. About all of it. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 8, Rosa said, her hand on the doorknob. But not as your maid. I won't work for someone who treats his children like inconveniences. I'll come back to help those girls because somebody needs to. But you need to decide what kind of father you want to be. Because what you're doing now isn't working. She walked out, closing the door quietly behind her. David stood alone in his expensive apartment with his 3 sleeping daughters down the hall. The apartment that had always felt like such an achievement suddenly felt empty, cold, wrong. He walked slowly to Rachel's room and pushed the door open. In the soft glow of the nightlight, he could see all 3 girls sleeping peacefully, tangled together in a pile of blankets and stuffed animals. They looked so small, so innocent, so completely dependent on him to be better than he was. For the first time in longer than he could remember, David Chen felt something crack in his chest. It might have been his pride, or maybe it was the wall he'd built around his heart. Whatever it was, it hurt. He sat down on the floor and leaned against Rachel's bed, watching his daughters sleep. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, exhausted and emotionally drained, he finally understood what Rosa had been trying to tell him. His daughters didn't need a better house or more therapy or another nanny. They needed him. The real him, not the businessman or the provider or the manager, just their dad. The question was, could he figure out how to be that? Or was it already too late? Rosa arrived at 8 the next morning, expecting to find a termination notice and her final paycheck. Instead, she found David sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's clothes with 2 cups of coffee already poured. One for him. One for her. He stood up when she walked in, awkward and uncertain. The confidence she was used to seeing was gone. He looked tired, vulnerable, human. I don't know how to do this, he said. No explanation of what this meant. No excuses or justifications. Just a simple admission that stripped away all his usual defenses. I don't know how to reach them. Rosa set down her bag slowly. This was the moment. She could walk away right now. Find another job with another family. Stay in the comfortable role of employee and nothing more. But when she looked at David's face, she didn't see the cold businessman who'd handed her that list 3 weeks ago. She saw a father who was finally ready to learn. She pulled out the chair and sat down, taking the cup of coffee he'd poured for her. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. He was treating her like an equal, like someone whose presence mattered. Then I'll teach you, she said simply. But you have to actually try. Not half try. Not when it's convenient. Really try. What started that morning was something neither of them had expected. An education. A partnership. A complete transformation of how the Chen household worked. Rosa didn't ask David's permission to change things. She just started showing him. That first morning when Rachel came down for breakfast, she was already agitated. Her pajamas had a tag that was bothering her, and the morning sunlight coming through the windows felt too bright to her sensitive eyes. David's instinct was to tell her to tough it out, that she needed to learn to deal with minor discomforts, Rosa stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Watch," she said quietly. She dimmed the lights in the kitchen, then knelt down to Rachel's level. She didn't tell Rachel to stop complaining. Instead, she asked, "The tag is scratchy?" Rachel nodded, tears already forming. Rosa produced scissors from her pocket and carefully cut out the tag. Just like that. Problem solved in 10 seconds. Certain fabrics feel like sandpaper against her skin, Rosa explained to David. Fluorescent lights feel like needles in her eyes. Sudden sounds feel like someone's hitting her. She's not being dramatic or difficult. She's in actual pain. "Would you want to wear a shirt covered in sandpaper?" David stared at the tiny tag Rosa had cut out. Something so small. Something he'd told Rachel to ignore hundreds of times. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I know," Rosa replied. "But now you do. So what are you going to do about it?" Over the next few days, Rosa and David went through Rachel's entire wardrobe together. They removed tags from every piece of clothing. They got rid of anything made from scratchy material. They bought soft, seamless clothes that wouldn't bother her. David even helped create a sensory corner in Rachel's room with soft lighting, weighted blankets, and noise-canceling headphones. A place she could go when the world felt like too much. The first time Rachel used that corner and came out calm instead of having a complete meltdown, David felt something shift inside him. He'd actually helped her, not by throwing money at the problem, but by understanding what she needed and providing it. Grace was the next lesson. David had always been frustrated by her communication tablet, seeing it as a crutch that prevented her from learning to talk. Rosa saw it completely differently. "This isn't a crutch," Rosa explained, holding up Grace's tablet. "This is her voice. Every picture she chooses, every word she types, that's her telling you about her world. Would you ignore someone because they spoke a different language than you?" She sat David down and made him actually learn how to use the tablet, not just glance at it and walk away, but really understand it. Each symbol had meaning. Each combination told a story. Grace had been trying to communicate with him for years. He just hadn't been listening. That afternoon, Grace came running up with her tablet, excited about something. David's first instinct was to say, "That's nice, honey," and keep working. But Rosa gave him a look. He stopped. He sat down on the floor so he was at Grace's eye level. He took his time looking at what she was showing him. It was a series of pictures. A bird, a tree, their backyard, the park. Grace was trying to tell him about a beautiful bird she'd seen that morning with Rosa. Not just there was a bird, but a whole story about how it had red feathers and how it sang a pretty song and how it flew away toward the park. David felt his throat tighten. His 6-year-old daughter had something to share with him and he'd almost missed it. Again. "That's amazing, Grace. Was the bird as big as your hand?" "Bigger?" Grace started tapping frantically, showing him more details. They spent 20 minutes having a real conversation. His first real conversation with his daughter in years. When Grace finally wandered off to play, satisfied that her dad had actually heard her, David looked at Rosa with tears in his eyes. "I've been walking past her for 3 years. She's been trying to talk to me and I've been walking past her." "Yes," Rosa said gently. "But you're not walking past her now. Mia's lessons were different." David had always enforced her routine rigidly, but he'd done it out of control, not understanding. Rosa showed him the difference. "The routine isn't a prison," she explained one evening. "It's Mia's way of feeling safe in a world that feels chaotic and unpredictable. But she also needs to learn that change doesn't mean catastrophe. You have to help her build that bridge." They started small. Instead of just saying lunch is at noon, they started preparing Mia 5 minutes early. In 5 minutes, we're having lunch. Then 4 minutes. Then 3. They used visual timers so Mia could see the time passing. They practiced tiny changes with lots of support. Taking a different chair at the table. Eating dessert before dinner one night as a silly switch. Adding a new food to the plate but not requiring her to eat it. Each small flexibility was celebrated. Each time Mia handled a change, even if she was anxious about it, David was there to tell her how proud he was. How brave she was. How strong she was becoming. David started coming home earlier. He began sitting on the floor during playtime instead of watching from the doorway. He learned to speak softer, move slower, see the world through his daughter's eyes. He still made mistakes. Lots of them. But now when he messed up, he apologized. He asked Rosa what he should have done differently. He tried again. Rosa watched the transformation with quiet amazement. She'd worked with many parents over the years. Some never changed. Some changed a little. But David was completely rebuilding himself from the ground up. He was learning a new language, the language of his own daughters. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, Rachel had a difficult day at school. Overwhelming sensory input, a substitute teacher who didn't understand her needs, and a fire drill that terrified her. She came home completely dysregulated. David's first instinct was to call Rosa, who'd already left for the day. His finger hovered over her number. Then he stopped. He remembered everything she'd taught him. Every technique, every bit of wisdom. He could do this. He had to do this. He dimmed the lights, turned off all unnecessary noise, put on the soft music that Rachel liked. He didn't try to force her to calm down or tell her to stop being upset. He just created a calm space and sat nearby, a quiet presence. Rachel's screaming slowly subsided. Her thrashing calmed. After 20 minutes, she crawled over to him and climbed into his lap. Something she'd never ever done before. David wrapped his arms around his daughter and felt tears streaming down his face. She was letting him comfort her. She trusted him. After everything, she still trusted him. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he whispered into her hair. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." Rachel didn't respond. She just nestled deeper into his arms, her body finally relaxing completely. The next morning, David told Rosa about it. He was almost glowing. "I did it. I actually helped her through a meltdown on my own." Rosa smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're learning to be their father. Not their manager. Not their boss. Their father." Something had shifted between them over these weeks. The employer-employee boundary had blurred into something more like a partnership. Sometimes, late at night when the girls were asleep, they'd sit in the kitchen and just talk. David would ask questions about how Rosa knew so much about children. She'd tell him stories about her own kids, now grown, and about the many families she'd worked with over the years. "My own children had challenges too," she admitted one evening. "Different challenges than your girls, but hard ones. I wasn't always a good mother at first. I had to learn, just like you're learning. The difference is whether you're willing to do the work." David looked at this woman who'd come into his home as hired help and had become so much more. A teacher, a guide, maybe even a friend. "I treated you terribly when you first started," he said. "Like you were beneath me. Like you didn't matter." "Yes, you did," Rosa agreed, not sugarcoating it. "I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what my daughters needed. About what being a father meant." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Thank you for not giving up on us. For seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself." Rosa reached across the table and patted his hand. "You did the hard part, David. I just showed you the door. You're the one who walked through it." Looking back, David could barely recognize the man he'd been 2 months ago. The one who stood at windows surveying his empire while his daughters suffered. The one who thought love could be purchased and parenting could be outsourced. The one who treated a good, kind woman with contempt because she cleaned his house for a living. He'd been so lost. So completely lost. And he hadn't even known it. But now, as he watched his 3 daughters playing together, laughing together, occasionally running to him for help or comfort or just to share something exciting, he understood what real success looked like. It wasn't in the penthouse or the cars or the bank account. It was in Grace bringing him her tablet to share a story. In Rachel feeling safe enough to fall asleep in his arms. In Mia trusting him to help her navigate changes. It was in being needed. Being loved. Being there. That was everything. 2 months had passed since that terrible night when everything changed. The Chen household had found a rhythm it had never known before. David was working from home more, building his schedule around the girls rather than fitting them into the margins of his life. Rachel's meltdowns had decreased dramatically. Grace was using her tablet more confidently to share her thoughts and feelings. Mia was learning that while routines were important, small changes didn't mean the world was ending. Rosa had become more than an employee. She was part of the family. The girls would light up when she arrived each morning. David would have coffee ready and they'd discuss the day's plans together. She'd even started joining them for dinner a few nights a week, something that would have been unthinkable when she first started working there. On Saturday morning, everything was perfect. David was teaching Mia how to make pancakes. letting her measure ingredients even though some flour spilled on the counter. Rachel was painting at the kitchen table, creating beautiful swirls of color that she was excited to show Rosa later. Grace was playing with her tablet, practicing new words she wanted to learn. Then the doorbell rang. David wiped his hands on a towel and went to answer it, expecting maybe a package delivery. Instead, he found his ex-wife Catherine standing there in a designer suit, perfect makeup, every hair in place. Next to her was a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Hello, David," Catherine said with a cold smile. "We need to talk." David's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard from Catherine since the divorce was finalized 7 months ago. She'd sent her lawyer to handle everything, taken her settlement, and disappeared to start her new life. Why was she here now? "This is my attorney, Mr. Harrison," Catherine continued, not waiting for an invitation to come in. They walked past David into the living room. "We're here to discuss custody arrangements." David felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" "The custody is settled. We have joint custody with me as primary guardian." Mr. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "My client is filing a motion to modify custody. She's seeking primary physical custody of the 3 minor children, with you having supervised visitation only." The world seemed to tilt. David grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "What? Why? On what grounds?" Catherine sat down on the sofa like she owned the place. "Let's be honest, David, you can barely take care of yourself, much less 3 special needs children. I've remarried. My husband is a pediatric surgeon at the children's hospital. We have a stable, nurturing home environment. The girls will be better off with us." "Better off? They're happy here. They're thriving." David's voice rose and he forced himself to take a breath. Getting emotional wouldn't help. Mr. Harrison pulled out more documents. "We have testimony from 7 former nannies regarding your emotional unavailability and inability to manage the children's special needs. We have documentation of multiple incidents where the children were left unsupervised or improperly cared for. We have evidence that you frequently prioritize work over your daughter's well-being." Each point hit like a physical blow because David knew they were true. They were all things he'd done before Rosa came, before he'd learned to be a real father. But how could he prove he'd changed? "That was before," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've changed. The girls are doing so much better now." Catherine laughed, a harsh sound without humor. 2 months, David? You've been an adequate father for 2 months and you think that erases 3 years of neglect? The courts will see through that. You're scrambling to look good before the hearing, but your history speaks for itself." Mr. Harrison handed David the custody petition. "The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. You'll want to get yourself a lawyer, a good one." They left as quickly as they'd come, leaving David standing in his living room holding papers that could take away his daughters. He heard small footsteps behind him and turned to see all 3 girls standing there. They'd heard everything. Not all of it, maybe, but enough to know something was very wrong. Rachel's face was scrunched up with worry. Grace was gripping her tablet so hard her knuckles were white. Mia looked like she might cry. David dropped to his knees and opened his arms. All 3 girls rushed to him and he held them as tight as he could. "It's okay," he whispered, even though he wasn't sure it was. "Everything's going to be okay." But the fear in their eyes said they knew something bad was happening. And the worst part was, David wasn't sure he could stop it. Rosa arrived Monday morning to find David sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread everywhere, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd been calling lawyers all weekend, trying to find someone who could help. The girls were quieter than usual, sensing the tension in the house. When David finally hung up, Rosa sat down across from him. "Tell me what's happening." He explained everything. Catherine's surprise visit, the custody petition, the testimony from former nannies, the hearing in 3 weeks. "Her case is strong, Rosa. I was a terrible father for 3 years. I have proof of 2 months of being better. How do I fight that?" Rosa listened carefully, her face serious. Then she said something that surprised him. "You tell the truth. You don't hide what you were. You show them who you've become." Over the next week, David's lawyer gathered evidence. Work logs showing his adjusted schedule. Testimony requests from the girls' therapists. School reports showing improved behavior and emotional regulation at home. Character references from friends and colleagues. But David knew the strongest evidence was something harder to prove. The connection he'd built with his daughters. The way Rachel now came to him when she was overwhelmed instead of melting down alone. The way Grace trusted him to understand her communication. The way Mia looked to him for security and guidance. How do you show that in a courtroom? Then Rosa showed him something. A journal she'd been keeping. Not for any legal purpose, she explained, but just because she wanted to remember these moments. Page after page of observations. Rachel's meltdowns decreasing from 3 or 4 a day to maybe once a week. Grace initiating more conversations with her father. Mia handling changes more flexibly. There were photos too. David on the floor playing with the girls. Reading stories. Helping with art projects. Holding Rachel during a difficult moment. Celebrating Grace's communication milestones. Teaching Mia that change could be okay. This is you being their father, Rosa said. Not perfect. Still learning. But trying every single day. David's lawyer was excited about the journal. It showed documented, sustained improvement. But he warned David that Catherine's team would argue it was too little, too late. They'd say David was just putting on a show for the courts. The night before the hearing, after the girls were asleep, David and Rosa sat in the kitchen. The same kitchen where this whole journey had started. Where Rosa had confronted him about being a better father. Where he'd had his first real conversation with Grace using her tablet. Where he'd taught Mia to be brave about small changes. I can't lose them, David said, his voice breaking. Not now. Not when I've finally figured out how to be their dad. Rosa reached across the table and took his hand. You won't be alone tomorrow, and neither will they. David looked at this woman who'd come into his life as someone he'd dismissed, someone he'd looked down on because she cleaned houses for a living. She'd become one of the most important people in his world. She'd saved his family. She'd saved him. I was so wrong about you, he said quietly. When you first started working here, I treated you like you didn't matter, like you were less than me because of what you did for a living. I know, Rosa said simply. You taught me everything that matters, how to see my daughters, how to love them properly, how to be the father they deserved. He paused. You taught me that a person's worth has nothing to do with their job title or bank account. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. Rosa squeezed his hand. You were lost, David. People who are lost can't see what's right in front of them. But you found your way. That's what matters. David looked toward the hallway where his daughters were sleeping. 3 little girls who'd been slowly breaking under his cold, distant parenting. 3 little girls who were now thriving because he'd finally learned to really be their father. Tomorrow, a judge would decide if he got to keep being their father. If all this growth and change was enough. If 2 months of transformation could outweigh 3 years of failure. He'd done everything he could. Gathered evidence. Prepared testimony. Hired the best lawyer he could afford. But in the end, it came down to one question. Was he really a different man than he'd been 6 months ago? Looking at the photos Rosa had taken, at the journal entries documenting daily moments of connection and growth, at the evidence of 3 little girls who were happier and healthier than they'd ever been, David knew the answer. Yes, he was different. He was better. He was finally the father his daughters deserved. The question was whether a judge would see it. Whether 2 months would be enough. Whether the man he'd become could overcome the man he used to be, he wouldn't know until tomorrow. But whatever happened, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never stop fighting for his daughters. Never stop trying to be better. Never stop being the father they needed. Rosa had shown him the way. But he'd done the work of walking that path. Of changing. Of growing. And nobody could take that away from him regardless of what the court decided. Tomorrow would determine where his daughters lived. But David had already won the most important battle. He'd won back his daughters' trust. Their love. Their willingness to let him be their dad. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. As a family. The courthouse felt cold and sterile. Everything designed in hard lines and uncomfortable chairs. David had prepared for this by bringing Rachel's noise-canceling headphones and her weighted lap pad. The fact that he knew to do this, that it was automatic for him now, was proof of how much he'd changed. But would it be enough? The courtroom slowly filled up. Catherine arrived with her new husband, both dressed expensively and looking confident. Her lawyer had a stack of folders that seemed impossibly thick. David's lawyer, Mr. Chen, had smaller folders but kept reassuring him they had a strong case. Catherine's team went first, and it was brutal. They called 3 former nannies who testified about David's coldness, his inability to handle the girls' meltdowns, his constant prioritization of work over family. One nanny described him standing helplessly while Rachel had a complete breakdown, then just walking away. Another talked about how he'd fire people for suggesting he spend more time with his daughters. The testimony painted a picture of a man who saw his children as burdens. Problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. Each story hit David hard because he remembered those moments. He remembered being that person. Cold, distant, lost. Catherine took the stand next. Her performance practiced and convincing. "I tried for years to get through to him," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I begged him to connect with our daughters, to see them as more than just additional responsibilities. But he couldn't do it. When I left, it wasn't because I stopped loving him. It was because I couldn't watch our children suffer anymore." She described her new life, her stable marriage to a pediatric surgeon who understood special needs children. She talked about the therapy resources they could provide, the stable routine, the nurturing environment. On paper, she sounded like the perfect mother. David's lawyer tried to poke holes in her story during cross-examination. He pointed out that she'd been absent for 7 months, that she'd shown no interest in the girls during that time, that she'd left them with the very father she now claimed was inadequate. But Catherine had answers for everything, delivered with perfect composure. When it was David's turn, his lawyer called the girls' therapists first. Rachel's occupational therapist testified about the dramatic improvement in her sensory regulation over the past 2 months. She noted that Rachel's meltdowns had decreased by over 80%, which was remarkable progress. "What changed?" David's lawyer asked. "Her father became attuned to her needs," the therapist replied. "He learned to read her cues to prevent sensory overload rather than just react to it. He created a home environment that supports her nervous system." Grace's speech therapist talked about the breakthrough in father-daughter communication. Grace has been trying to connect with her father for years through her communication device. In the past 2 months, he's finally learned her language. She's now initiating conversations with him multiple times daily, which shows a level of trust and connection that wasn't there before. Mia's behavioral therapist described how Mia's anxiety had decreased significantly. Children with autism often need predictability, but they also need to learn flexibility. Mr. Chen has found that balance. He provides structure while gently helping Mia expand her comfort zone. The results speak for themselves. Then David took the stand. His lawyer had coached him to be professional, to stay calm, to present the facts. But when he sat down and saw his 3 daughters in the courtroom, something inside him shifted. "I'm not going to pretend I was a good father 3 years ago," he started, his voice steady but emotional. "I wasn't. I was cold, distant. I treated my daughters like problems I could solve by throwing money at them. I hired people to do the hard work of parenting because I didn't know how to do it myself." Catherine's lawyer smiled, probably thinking David was making his case for him. "When my wife left, I didn't understand why. I thought I was doing everything right. I provided for my family. I got the girls the best therapy money could buy. I kept a perfect schedule. But what I didn't do was see them. Really see them." David's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "Then Rosa came to work for me, and she showed me what I'd been missing. She showed me that Rachel wasn't being difficult when she melted down over scratchy clothes. She was in genuine pain. She showed me that Grace wasn't refusing to communicate. She was communicating and I just wasn't listening. She showed me that Mia needed routine not because she was inflexible, but because predictability made her feel safe in a scary world." He looked directly at the judge. "I spent 2 months learning to be a real father. Not the father I thought I should be, but the father my daughters actually needed. And yes, 2 months isn't that long compared to 3 years of failure. But those 2 months changed everything. My daughters trust me now. They come to me when they're scared. They share their joys with me. They let me comfort them. That didn't happen overnight. That happened because I did the work. Every single day." Catherine's lawyer tried to make him look bad during cross-examination. "Isn't it convenient that you suddenly became Father of the Year right before custody proceedings?" "I didn't know there would be custody proceedings," David replied calmly. "I changed because I finally understood that I was losing my daughters emotionally. Not to a court, but to my own failure to connect with them. I changed because Rosa made me see what I was doing to them. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Then it was Rosa's turn to testify." Catherine's lawyer tried to dismiss her as the help, implying her testimony was biased or bought. But Rosa stood her ground. "I've worked in many homes over 25 years, she said, her accent stronger under stress but her voice clear. "I've seen many types of parents. Some who never change no matter what, some who change a little when pushed, and very rarely I see someone who looks at themselves honestly and decides to become completely different." She pulled out her journal. "I didn't make this for court. I made it because I wanted to remember these moments. The first time Rachel came to David for comfort instead of hiding in her room. The first time Grace used her tablet to have a real conversation with her father. The first time Mia trusted David to help her through anxiety instead of just enforcing rules she didn't understand." Rosa's voice grew stronger. "Mr. Chen wasn't a good father when I met him. That's true. But he's a good father now. Not perfect. Still learning. But present, connected, loving. His daughters need him, and he's finally become the father they deserve." Catherine's lawyer pressed her. "You're paid by Mr. Chen. Of course you'd say positive things about him." Rosa looked the lawyer directly in the eye. "I've quit jobs before when I saw children being mistreated. I could have quit this one, but I stayed because I saw something worth fighting for. 3 little girls who needed their father to wake up. And a father who was brave enough to change." The judge called for a 30-minute recess. David spent that time with his daughters in a private room. Rachel sat close to him, her small hand holding his. Grace showed him pictures on her tablet of things she wanted to do when they got home. Mia asked if her routine would change, her anxiety clear in her voice. "I don't know what's going to happen," David told them honestly, "but I promise you, no matter what, I'm going to fight for you, because you're the most important things in my life." When court resumed, the judge had reviewed all the evidence. The testimony, the therapy reports, the photos, Rosa's journal, the documented history of David's failures and his recent transformation. "I've been a family court judge for 18 years, she began. "I've seen a lot of cases, and this one is particularly complex. On one hand, we have a documented history of inadequate parenting by the father. On the other hand, we have clear evidence of substantial and genuine change." David held his breath. "Ms. Chen Morrison," the judge addressed Catherine, "your concern for your daughters is noted. However, the court also notes that you've been absent from their lives for 7 months. You made no attempt at contact during that time, showed no interest in their progress, and only filed for custody after they had become settled in an improved home environment." Catherine's confident expression faltered.